Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm going to be bringing you a little bit of a different webinar today. I thought this would be maybe something fun and with the assistance of ChatGPT, I am going to be doing what I conceptualized as an AI AMA. So a ChatGPT generated Ask Me Anything. So you'll see my screen here. I'm sharing it on my ChatGPT, and I have prompted it with the following. You are helping moderate a webinar about M&A for MSPs. I want you to ask me questions that would be of interest to buyers and sellers. The questions can pertain to any aspect of the M&A process. I want you to ask me one question at a time and for the questions to be asked in a random order. So pretty self-explanatory here, but I'm going to be doing my best to riff on these various questions as proposed by ChatGPT. So let's see how this goes. What do you see as the biggest challenge MSP owners face when preparing their business for sale? So this is one where I could certainly go in different directions. I'll tell you, the two that come to mind for me are one, the personal aspects of what are you going to do after you sell the business? Are you comfortable uh, with the prospect of retiring? Um, do you have the financial wherewithal to meet your goals in your next stage of life? So I think that's probably the biggest challenge. But the other one that comes to mind for me here is just in terms of preparing the financials for the business, and making sure that the financials are broken out such that you can demonstrate revenues and expenses by different service lines, and kind of just have the books all polished up nicely in a way that's going to be appealing to buyers. So those are the two that come to mind for me there. So move on to the next question. How should buyers evaluate the strength and reliability of an MSP's recurring revenue model during due diligence? So, the strength, I mean, obviously the strength of it can largely come from the financials and whether there's contracts. And when it comes to reliability, again, it comes down to the contracts and also the customer concentration. So here you want to see that, there's a larger proportion of recurring revenue from MSP services with relatively little tied to, software, which also could be recurring, but it's typically lower margin. Same thing with hardware as a service too. That could be recurring, but it's typically lower margin. So you want to see more of the pure play MSP recurring revenue, and you want the customers to be tied to contracts, ideally long-term contracts that are auto-renewing. You also don't want to see too much customer concentration. So for instance, with SBA loans, anything above 20% for one customer typically raises red flags. So that's kind of an interesting data point to keep in mind here. But the more customer concentration just means that recurring revenue isn't going to be as reliable. All right, next. What are the most common deal structures you see in MSP acquisitions, and how do they impact both parties post-close? So there are multiple components of most acquisitions. Usually you have, an amount paid at close. Not always, but 99% of deals you're going to have some amount paid at close. Then you have some seller's financing, or also called like a holdback payment, which are amounts from the valuation that are paid out over time, typically within 1 or 2 years. But I've seen offers up to 10 years for that matter. Then you have earnouts, which are similar to seller's financing, except that they're tied to a contingency, usually based on revenue being maintained. Then you can also have deals where there's a rollover equity component where the seller retains a proportion of the ownership in the business. So those are the ones that we typically see. Also, while not strictly related to the acquisition, there's compensation for the owner if they do want to stick around, either in a consultancy basis, or as an employee. So those, in terms of the financial structures, that's what we most typically see. And if I was going to look at this question a different way, you could also say there's asset deals and share deals and also hybrid. But for the asset deal, you're buying the customer list, you're buying the website, the brand, the employees, the vendor contracts. but you're not actually buying the entire company versus a stock deal, or also known as a share deal, where you are buying the actual legal entity and everything that belongs to it. So hopefully that covers off that question. All right, next one. From a seller's perspective, what steps can be taken in advance to maximize valuation before going to market? So I think the biggest one here is trying to get as many clients on recurring contracts as possible. Again, the recurring MSP revenue is what gets the highest multiple, and buyers are really looking at that as the holy grail. So, to the extent to which you can convert your break fix or your hourly clients to full managed contracts, ideally those 3-year auto renewing contracts, that is really going to help maximize the valuation. Okay, so let's go for another one here. How important is cultural alignment between the buyer and seller in MSP transactions, and what strategies can assess it effectively? So this one is tricky. Cultural alignment is very important because you don't want to have a transaction where there's churn after the fact due to cultural reasons. And it can be churn for customers, obviously, but also for employees. Either situation is a negative for both the buyer and the seller. Most sellers want to really have a good home for their employees and their customers. These are often businesses they've been working in for 10, 20, 30 years. It's their baby, and they want to make sure that everyone is taken care of. And then from the buyer's perspective, obviously, they're buying the revenue stream from the customer. So any customers that churn, it's a big problem. But they also are buying the operations and the employees that are making the business run. So if any employees leave, that's also a huge problem. What strategies can help access it effectively? You know, I think that to a large degree, this is a bit of a gut feel exercise. So in your meetings before an LOI is signed, what's your gut feel on whether or not you could work with that person effectively, whether they do seem like somebody who would be, able to operate the business in a way that would be in cultural alignment with you? One question I always like to advise sellers to ask of buyers is, what is their approach to corporate culture? And you'll see sometimes that buyers who kind of hum and haw on this question don't really have a good answer. They don't come across that well, and it's quite telling. Whereas some other buyers, have ready to go extensive information about how they look at company culture, and that comes across quite well. I've even seen buyers have a PowerPoint that was just happened to be ready to go that they pull up on a call, and that really demonstrates to the seller that they have really thought out their company culture, and it's of a great deal of importance. And then for the buyer, in terms of trying to figure out the seller's company culture, again, a lot of it's going to come down to gut feel, meeting the seller and asking them the questions. But potentially, you could also ask if they have any sort of employee satisfaction surveys. In terms of the culture as it applies to customer service with clients, you could ask for transcriptions of recent QBRs that the sellers team has had with their clients to get a feel for how those clients are feeling in their current arrangements. So there are some ways, but I do feel like this is largely about gut feel and trying to feel people out in a kind of a qualitative way instead of a quantitative way. Next, what role does customer concentration play in determining risk and valuation during an MSP acquisition? So we touched on this a little bit, but it is quite large. If you have a customer who is making up more than, say, 20% of your revenue, again, is a really high level threshold, then it's going to be problematic. It is going to eliminate a lot of the prospective buyers who might otherwise be interested. Um, and the people who do remain and still are interested, they're probably going to want to tie a greater degree of the valuation to either an earnout or a contingency that is a contingent payment rather that is based around that large customer renewing their contract next time it's up for renewal. So it is a very large factor. We have seen MSPs that we've sold where they have very large degrees of customer concentration. So it's not a deal breaker, but it factors into a great degree. All right, next, how do earnouts typically function in MSP M&A deals, and what should both buyers and sellers watch out for? So the function here is to help mitigate the risk, right? And we talk to a lot of sellers who, when they first learn about earnouts, are just 100% opposed to the idea. But then when they start to actually field offers from buyers, they kind of appreciate how, ultimately the offers that have an earnout in them are getting them a higher valuation and are spreading out the risk in a way that kind of works out for both parties. Most sellers are concerned about the notion of, hey, I'm going to sell my business and, I'm not going to be in control of it any longer. So why should I be rewarded based on how the buyer is operating the business, which is fair. Um, but at the end of the day, if you have a business that is kind of growing on itself year over year, and it seems like the threshold for the earnout is reasonable, then it might be worth taking that gamble if you can get a higher valuation on the whole. So that is really the function, is to help kind of bridge the gap there, give both parties risks that they're comfortable with, and ultimately get a higher valuation. Typically, we see earnouts that are 6 months, 1 year, 2 years in length. We usually try to recommend that they're not all or nothing. In other words, if you miss the earnout threshold by a dollar, you're not going to lose the entirety of the earnout. Usually, we like to recommend that it goes in buckets where maybe there's a different threshold every 10%. So that, so if you come 10% lower, then you lose 10% of the earnout. If you're 20% lower, you lose 20% of the earnout, and so on. Also, quite often, what we like to do is to suggest that there should be an upside too. So, because the seller would be taking on some downside risk, they should have some benefit if the revenues go up. And often that's a win-win because it will motivate the seller to stick around in some sort of a role, perhaps more of a sales role than what they were doing before, to try to increase the revenues and earnings, which is a win-win for the seller and the buyer. Okay, let's just do a couple more here, then we'll wrap it up for today. What are some of the key red flags buyers should look for when reviewing an MSP's financials and contracts? One of the big ones, which is a little bit counterintuitive, is just if the MSP is too profitable. It's a bit of a red flag, and it is counterintuitive because obviously profitability is great. And there could be a really good reason why the MSP is particularly profitable. Maybe they've just developed a great operation. Maybe the clients are really low maintenance. Um, Allowing them to do more with relatively less staff and resources. But sometimes it is indicative of a couple challenges. One being that the previous owner is just working like a crazy amount of hours. Like they're working 80 hours a week. They're doing every aspect of the business. And that their role is not going to be easy to be replaced by one employee, that you might need to hire 2 or 3 employees to replace what the owner was doing before. So once you factor in the need to replace those 2 or 3 employees, it really hits the earnings, and the profitability doesn't make sense on an ongoing basis. And the other thing is, sometimes when the profitability is really high, it could mean that the MSP is using like open source tools instead of the kind of best in class vendors. And so from a buyer's perspective, you might look at that and go, okay, well, fair enough, but we're going to have to transition all these clients onto our own tools, incur the costs associated with doing so. And again, it would affect the profitability on a go forward basis. So that's kind of one of the most key ones, is just making sure the profitability is in line with, industry norms, which would probably be in that, the 20 to 30% would be typical for a lot of MSPs. Okay, let's wrap it up with the last one here. How does the availability and retention of technical talent influence the success of an MSP transaction? So we touched on this before, but it is really important. The last thing that either party wants is to have employees leave, especially the technical employees. Because obviously things like maybe like your bookkeeper or your marketing staff might be redundant in a transaction, and the buyer can plug in their own staff there. But when it comes to the technical employees who have the specific knowledge about the customers, who have the relationships with the customers, losing those can really cause customer churn to be much more likely. So, making sure that those people are well taken care of by, really making sure that they understand the benefits of the acquisition from their perspective. Financially, what's their salary going to be? Are they going to get a raise? Are they going to get a signing bonus? In terms of like their career path, is there going to be opportunities for them to explore new technologies, to take on more, advanced role within the organization, to increase their level of education and to get new certifications? All those things, all the benefits from the employee's perspective should be communicated, immediately post close, and there should be a good plan there to make sure those technical staff can be retained. So listen, we'll stop there. That was fun. I thought it would just be kind of a new format here for one of our videos. Let me know if you like this format. We could do it again. And appreciate you watching. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can contact us through our website, www.thehostbroker.com. Thanks so much.